I've been asked to talk a little bit about history of revival, which is a huge topic, as a matter of fact, because really revival has been a part of the church since its beginning. I mean, it shows up periodically. Often in the early periods and into the Middle Ages, revival showed up first in new forms of monasticism or new forms of community life. And particularly, for example, in the 13th century, at a time when the church was kind of institutional and heavily centrally, powerful and rich and kind of a monolith almost, Dominic and Francis, and mostly Dominic, took on seriously the notion of preaching to people, preaching the gospel to people who might not hear it in their local churches, who might be to some extent put off by the formality, by the insistence on structure, and so a lot of stuff happened in response to that. One of the things that I think when we talk about revival, as we've come to know it and experience it, is to trace it back to Germany, to actually what's now Czechoslovakia, but it was part of Czech Republic, but was part of Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire at the time. In the late 17th century, at a time when the Enlightenment was gaining strength and when rationalism was beginning to be a large part of the philosophical and thinking crowd, a man named Philip Spener, who was a pastor in the Lutheran Church, underground Reformed church in a very Catholic country, started to speak and to preach about the religion of the heart, to form Bible studies, to form prayer groups that sort of put aside the heavy emphasis on doctrine and formalism in the church, and begin to transform that a little bit. Over time, this movement ran afoul of some of the Roman Catholic authorities and moved into part of Saxony, and began to have some influence there. And one of the people that Spener's movement influenced was a minor noble in Saxony named Nicholas von Zinzendorf. And Zinzendorf, whose godfather was Philip Spener, formed a community in a little place called Herrnhut. And out of this commitment to a common shared life, out of this commitment to prayer, to preaching, to study, to living together as a community, the Moravian church emerged. And just incidentally, we are in full communion with the Moravian church, and that came about sometime in the last 15 years. I don't remember exactly, but so we continue to have ties with the Moravians. Interesting thing about the Moravians is that they had a passion for mission. Some of the earliest missionaries who went to serve the Native Americans, especially in the southern colonies of North America, were Moravian missionaries. And a man named John Wesley came into contact with Moravians coming back from his own failed mission experience in Georgia. And there was a huge storm at sea. He was terrified, and he found it interesting that the Moravians on the ship seemed to be quite calm and were singing prayers of praise, and he wanted to know what they had found that he had not found. So the Moravian church, the Moravian leaders, Zinzendorf himself had some conversations with Wesley over the years, but Wesley's own experience was, he talked about having his heart strangely warmed. It was not a heavily emotional experience. And Wesley's own preaching, which was widespread and massive and certainly revivalist in a sense, was, if you read his sermons, you wonder how people even stayed awake, actually. But and they went on for a while, but amazing things began to happen. He was preaching to people who had largely been outside the realm of the church. Their work, their schedule, their lives kept them from regular attendance, and at that time in the English church. It was, again, rationalist, very heavily influenced by deism, very heavily influenced by formalism, and a lot of clergy had livings in several places, and church services were taken by lay people, which is fine, but by local clergy who didn't necessarily have much training in preaching and were just going through the experience of leading morning prayer. He was preaching to people in fields. He was preaching to people in large amphitheater type places in Wales and Cornwall and Ireland and Scotland and all around England. And so he had a tremendous effect on the Anglican Church, which I might say was often quite suspicious of him. One of his contemporaries was a bishop named Butler, who really had a lot of negative things to say about Wesley's ministry, including the fact that this pretending to phenomena, an extraordinary phenomena, is a horrible thing. It didn't stop it, and many of Butler's own friends, that was part of the reason why he got so concerned, was that some of his own friends were very heavily affected by Wesley. But if Wesley was important in England, there was another Anglican priest who was very important in what became the United States. He was a little younger than Wesley, but when he went up to Oxford, Pembroke College in Oxford, he was a member of the Holy Club that Charles and John Wesley had formed there. His own sort of personal awakening seems to have come maybe even a little before Wesley's. And he was certainly one of the people who influenced Wesley to go out and preach in the fields. His name was George Whitefield. And he also came to America. He made a number of trips to America, and some people have estimated that he was probably the best known person of anyone in the colonies, because he was everywhere. He was started in the South, but he was all the way up into the northern colonies. He preached, some estimates are that he preached to 10 million people. He was so influential that even deists like Ben Franklin supported what he was doing. He had started out as an actor. He wanted to be an actor, and some of the criticism that he received was that he was too dramatic. There was a statement that somebody said that women swooned when he said the word Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. Try that on, for size. Mesopotamia. I'll have to work that into my sermons. But Jonathan Edwards had already, as a matter of fact, before Whitefield got there, what became the Great Awakening was already taking place. Whitefield fed it. Whitefield responded to it. He provided a venue for a lot of the preaching that came about in this period. But Jonathan Edwards had already begun in Boston, in areas around Boston, to preach in a different style from a lot of the Calvinist preaching. Now, he was a Calvinist, but he began to emphasize particularly the love of God and the possibility of genuine, deep connection and conversion to the God who was inviting people in love to know God. And people began to have some extraordinary experiences. And again, like Wesley, you read his sermons and it's hard to figure out what it was that touched him, because he certainly was not unintellectual. He certainly was not going against doctrine, but he was emphasizing different parts of it. And it caused a major split in some of the Calvinist churches in the United States, in the colonies. But some very interesting things came out of it, and including Princeton, Rutgers, Brown universities really came out of that movement. So there was always an emphasis on education, and there was always an emphasis on a certain kind of thoughtful rigor. It was not strictly about emotion, and yet the emphasis on love and personal conviction and personal conversion began to have a powerful effect on people. Some people have suggested that because of the Great Awakening, the colonies came into more contact with each other. There was certainly an ecumenical sense about this because this affected Baptists, it affected Congregationalists, Presbyterians, some Anglicans, brought people together to hear people like Whitefield and others, and formed a basis, perhaps, for the coming together of the colonies in a revolutionary way, shall we say. So it had some impact. But it did quiet down, and this is one of the other things about revival, is that it is not an ongoing phenomenon in the church. There are times when it seems to be a very powerful force, and yet at other times it seems to quiet down. And maybe that's appropriate. It gives people an opportunity to reframe, refocus, rest. There's a reason why a lot of the parts of western New York and Ohio, Pennsylvania were once called the burned over district, because you just get to the point where it can't sustain or doesn't sustain itself. But it left people perhaps with stronger churches, with stronger communities, with stronger faith. The Second Great Awakening began after the American Revolution and after there was a country. People were beginning to move out into what was then the Northwest Territories, places like Kentucky, Ohio. And one of the strategies for gathering community were 3-day communions, camp meetings. One of the most famous was the Cane Ridge camp meeting. Have people heard about the Cane Ridge movement? People began to come from various small communities around to a central location for a time of preaching and prayer and ending with communion. So it was never divorced from, at least not in those days, from a kind of commitment to the sacramental and religious structures of the church, but it was an addition to that. And this particular movement at Cane Ridge just caught fire, and these camp meetings began to spread around what was then the Northwest Territories. This lasted for a long time, and some people think of this kind of revival theology as being such a strong emphasis on personal renewal and personal holiness, and it certainly had those aspects, but it's important to say that much of the reform energy in the 19th century for things like abolition, for things like temperance, for things like peace later on, and for women's rights, I might say, came out of the evangelical movement of the 19th century. One of the most famous evangelical preachers of the time and revivalists was a man named Charles Grandison Finney. Finney was heavily involved in Oberlin College. One of the reasons why it became a stop on the Underground Railway and why it admitted men and women equally. Finney was a powerful preacher. He was also a believer in personal holiness. He was part of the holiness tradition, which again has some Wesleyan roots. And he was criticized for that. But he had a profound impact on people who would be very active in the abolition movement, including Theodore Weld and others. So what we think of today as evangelicalism in our country, that's only one strain of what has been a long strain of people who want to emphasize this kind of personal connection to a living God who calls us into a new kind of covenantal relationship with him, the old covenant, but in a new time for us. Jim Wallace of Sojourners Magazine has said, I just read this recently, faith is personal, but it is never private. It is about claiming faith for ourselves in a way that moves us into involvement, into engagement, into responsibility for our communities and for our world. That's an equally valid and very powerful strand of evangelicalism that can come out of this kind of revival movement. So, and that's just a lot of what I wanted to say, but in the more recent history, I think the Episcopal Church has been involved in various forms of revival, even though we didn't necessarily talk about it in those terms. It was in the Episcopal Church, among the mainline churches in the middle part of the 20th century, that the charismatic movement really took hold. And whatever you think about that, it was a kind of revival. And it was certainly a part of that broader spectrum of revival ministry. Like all of these, it has had its detractors too. But I have to say that my own final decision probably to come to seminary, after I'd been flirting with the idea of most of my life, came out of an Episcopal, or of a Methodist, but it was a charismatic prayer and study group that finally reconnected me with my own sense of calling in a way that really did change everything for me. So the charismatic movement was one example of that. We have other examples that are perhaps a little more familiar to some of us. The Faith Alive movement, have any of you been involved in Faith Alive over the years?
Yes.
Yes, and also the Cursillo movement. Of course, it started in the Catholic Church, but it was adapted by the early 1970s in the Episcopal Church, and it is a way of sharing witness and testimony and prayer and singing and transforming lives. And it started right here in Iowa, by the way.
Happening is in that vein too.
Happening is very much in that vein, yes. So we have had various forms of revival in the Episcopal Church all along. And even some of the things that we think about in evangelical circles that have been revival, like, Billy Sunday started in Iowa, just in case you didn't know that. He was born and raised near Ames, and when I was in Sioux City, there used to be a tabernacle there. It was called the Billy Sunday Tabernacle, and it was one of the places he preached. And then, of course, Billy Graham was heavily influenced by that. Billy Graham, interesting person. I think when we think about revival, we think about Billy Graham a lot, for good and ill. But he always understood that it was not about the revival. It was about connecting people to God and about reconnecting them or connecting them for the first time to a local Christian community. He emphasized very strongly the building up of communities in the churches in the areas where he was going who would be there to support people after the revival was over. He did understand that very powerfully. As he grew older, he also became much more concerned about external issues, about social involvement and social engagement, and the rights of women, for example. So revival transforms the preachers as well as the people who are being preached to. And I think that's one of the advantages for it. Always dangerous. Every one of these things I've cited had people who were critical of it, had people who sort of focused on the revival and not on the purposes beyond the revival. But that doesn't mean that it is not an important and powerful work. And again, it is not our work to make the revival happen. We make space for it. We make space for God to work in our midst. So, I think I'll end there. The problem with this is that I had a lot more to say.